Beatrice was quite a resourceful woman. She decides at the end of the war to take up the government's offer and emigrates to Australia. Assisted passage, taking my granny Margaret, my great uncle Norman, and my great aunt Wynne. She gets a job as a seamstress. Norman gets a job as a cabinet maker. Wynne goes into service, and my gran, who was quite a formidable creature, had met a gentleman on the ship going over. His name was Jack Weeks, and they began courting, although when I do the maths, I think there was some courting went on the ship as well. Jack Weeks got a job as a coach driver, and he used to drive the coach for the holidaymakers, tourists, and people that wanted to get away from the heat of Sydney, which they're experiencing at the moment, as you well know, record levels. And he would take them up a very windy and tortuous road, which is now a fine motorway, up into the Blue Mountains. A beautiful, beautiful part of the world. If you ever get to Australia, try and get up to the Blue Mountains. Places like Laura and Katoomba, they are super. Up there was a grand hotel and resort, one of these hydro hotels where you could take the waters and that sort of thing. And that was his job. Jack and Margaret, they get married, and my Aunt Linda is born. The Depression hits Australia, and from what I can gather, I think it hit everywhere hard, but it hit Australia particularly hard. Gran decides to come back to the UK. I'm not quite sure why, but Jack is not in agreement, and he disappears. He just disappears off the face of the earth. Nobody saw him since. Just, it's a mystery. Whether he just went into the bush and changed his name, whether he fell foul of some skullduggery, I don't know. But that was the end of him. Gran comes back to Britain. Mum is born on the ship coming over, and her birth is registered in Southampton. Wynne marries a returned soldier, so she comes out of service and has a very comfortable life with this chap. Unfortunately, he's killed in the Second World War at Tobruk, where Dad was and where Fred was. So who knows, they may have crossed paths. Norman marries an Aussie girl and settles down quite happily. Gran gets a job back in Birmingham, working for the Lucas, as they called it, the big Lucas corporation, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers. Mum, Greta and Linda are supported by my great aunt May, Beatrice's sister. And life is not too bad. Gran gets promotion. She becomes a forewoman or a foreman, shop steward. World War II breaks out. Mum and Linda are evacuated. Birmingham is just too dangerous, especially Smethwick, where they live, where all the factories were. Gran brings her girls out on strike. Absolutely unheard of. But the conditions were so bad and their air raid shelter was so far from the factory, she decides it's not good enough. So the management do take notice, and they open up the crypt of the local church so that the girls can dash in there if an air raid starts. Mum went into service, very happy working for a solicitor and his family, and she always used to say, it makes me laugh, he was very rich. He had a Rover car and a cabin cruiser on the Norfolk Broads. So, I mean, that says it all. Aunt Wynne, now a widow, with a pension and a gold card, That's what were given to the war widows. She becomes a manageress at the Hydro, this big, wonderful resort. And she puts on all sorts of airs and graces amongst the Aussies, being a Brit. And we called her a Duchess, and she only died 4 years ago at the age of 103. So she did pretty well. She was a great traveller. She used to come to Britain quite often, and at one time she got a job and she was housekeeper to Marty Feldman. We've got photographs of, and it's just unbelievable, this bug-eyed comedian who was eccentric to say the least, and the tales she used to tell us, it was unbelievable. Linda marries my aunt. She marries a smashing chap called Oliver. They have loads of kids, my cousins. I forget how many. But we used to get photographs, and I used to be as jealous as hell because my cousins used to go to school on horseback, and the school had a stable, and the horses were stabled during the day, and then they'd ride back at night. I just, another world. Dad and Fred return from the war, doing quite well. They start a rugby team at the Old Mosleyans, they call it, which is their old grammar school. And they used to have dances and what have you. And to cut a long story short, Mum and Dad meet, and they get married. I think I was there at the wedding, doing the maths. But I guess at that time, lots of people were. Dad was what they call a journeyman. So he would go wherever the work was and wherever the money was. And as a jobbing carpenter, the very famous Henry Wiggins, who were nickel alloy smelters and foundry people, moved from Derrit End, Small Heath, the land of the Peaky Blinders. They moved to Hereford. A lot of labour available in Hereford, large, big open spaces, and they had a new factory built. And Dad worked on that for quite a few years. He had a caravan, which is where I grew up, and everything was fine. Then one day, Mum's spotted a house for sale, only half a mile up the road from where the caravan was. By now, some of my brothers and sisters were on their way and present, so Mum said, let's go for that house. She was a very frugal woman. Dad worked very hard, so they'd put some money aside. He got an hour or two off work. On his push bike, he went up to the auction, and he bought the house. 2 and 6 was the deposit he put down. And the auctioneer said, look, you cannot come to an auction with 2 and 6. You've stopped the auction, you've got the house, what are you going to do? Well, Dad, leave it to me, don't worry, it'll all be sorted. And somehow, I'm not sure how, because Dad was as bad as Granddad, he managed to get the money together for the deposit, got a mortgage, and we got the house. Dad went back to work. Mum moved house, or moved caravan to house, with a pram, with me walking beside it, and I think probably Andrew, who's 4 years younger than me, in the pram. I'd had another brother in between Andrew and I, but as the older ones here will know, there was terrible polio running around the country at that time, and unfortunately he succumbed to polio at 2 years old. Mum never spoke much about it, never went to his grave. I think to survive and push forward, she put that behind her. Anyway, we're backwards and forwards up and down the road with this blooming pram and all these chattels, and a lady across the road spots Mum and came over, and she said, look, my husband's got, in my part of the country we call it a dilly, a pickup truck. He'll move the stuff for you when he gets home from work. So that was good. And that lady was Mrs. Dominy, and she became Mum's bosom friend for 50 years. Very, very close friends. The two families were very close. Mrs. Dominy had daughters, but that didn't really manifest itself for quite a few years, much to my consternation. Dad got various other jobs once the Wiggins had finished. He worked on the motorway bridges and various other jobs until a contract came to his notice to do all the roofing on a big estate. In those days, Joe will know what I'm talking about, there were no trusses. Roofs were cut and built on the house. And especially when you've got hips and valleys, quite a complicated business. You've got to know what you're doing. Dad had met many Poles while in the army, and the opportunity presented itself. There was a Polish rehabilitation camp just up the road, and he got a gang of Poles together, and they took on this contract. He put his name to the contract, and it all went very well. These guys used to come to be paid out in our kitchen, and there was a couple of things that stuck in my mind. Each of them gave me threepence. They opened their wage packet, checked their money, signed the book, and gave me threepence. Threepence was a lot of money. I thought this was great. And they ruffled me hair, and I'd been instructed to say thank you, Mr. Potauba, Mr. Sikorsky, Mr. Tchaikovsky, Mr. Dolniak. Great stuff, great stuff. Mum would have bread and cheese on the table for them. They liked the French stick and a big block of cheese, and they committed the cardinal sin. They ate off their knife. I was forbidden to eat off my knife, but these guys were of a different era, a different ilk. They had these great big clasp, I'll never forget them, great big clasp knives, and they'd take the bread and they'd cut a chunk of bread, and then they'd cut a chunk of cheese, and they'd put their thumb on the top, and these great big sharp knives, they'd take the bread and eat it. And I thought, dodgy blokes, dodgy blokes. Dad joins the council. He gives up contracting, he settles down. I think the thing that was going through his mind was he didn't have any pension. So he thought, better get a job that pays a pension. And he became work superintendent for Hereford City Council. He had 5,000 council houses, 5 pubs, the library, museum, slipper baths, swimming pool, market hall, the town hall, the shire hall, and 20 public toilets. He had 100 blokes, so he was in his element. And he held that job till the day he retired. Mum had 6 children. Mum and Dad had 6 children. As I say, one didn't make it, Ian. I was the eldest, and I went into civil engineering. Andrew went into the Royal Navy. Jenny, she became a restaurant manageress. Alison was a secretary and married an army bomb disposal guy. Peter was a self-employed lorry driver, still is today, and as a sideline, he inspects what he calls zincos, and they're big baths of molten zinc, about as big as this room. Zinc's a very aggressive stuff, and it will eat its way out. So he goes and x-rays, and like a doctor with the old stethoscope on. Very, very dodgy, but it pays well, and there you go. Once we had all left home, Mum and Dad went their separate ways. It was many years before they actually divorced, but they were, I don't know, chalk and cheese, oil and water, so they went their separate ways. Mum became matron at Hereford Cathedral School for Boys, and Dad took early retirement from the council and took a job as a water bailiff for the local angling club, which was his in seventh heaven. He loved fishing. Yeah, all went pretty well. I went to the local primary school. One terrible, terrible incident occurred. I got mumps. But that wasn't the terrible incident, because it probably saved my life. Because we'd been secretly making a raft on the in the local sand and gravel quarry. And on the Saturday when it was to be launched, I wasn't there. I was in bed, poorly. They launched it, and it flipped over, and Roger and John Lewis, my very, very dear friends, twins, they both perished. They were exactly the same age as me to the day, and Mum and Mrs. Lewis had been in the maternity ward in Hereford at the same time. It was absolutely terrible. Mrs. Lewis had a nervous breakdown, went into the local asylum and never came out. Very, very sad. The other lad on the raft, Robert Taylor, he managed to scramble to the shore and was saved by somebody walking a dog. They managed to pull him out. And he survived and went on, married the daughter of the local garage owner, and I occasionally see him when I go up to Hereford. My brother Andrew now is coming up to school age, and Mum decides he's not going to go to the little country school that I went to. He's going to go to the city school. So I get moved to the city school to chaperone him on the bus, etc. What a shock. As old Jethro said, it was hell. I had the wrong clothes, the wrong accent, the wrong haircut, and I was thick. Thick compared to these city kids. They were sharp. They'd had a much better education than me, and it was city versus country. Let's just say there were many scraps, but I managed to hold my own and was assimilated into the hierarchy of the school, and met two lads who would be my pals up till today, other than Rodney. There's a picture I did of him over there. He and I were as thick as thieves. We were great pals. Unfortunately, he died in his 40s of multiple sclerosis, which is unbelievable because he was such a physical specimen, a real athlete. Didn't matter what was involved. The first time we went to the swim baths, we're all lined up, and the guy that took us said, "Who can swim?" And Rodney puts his hand up. I said, "You've never swum in your life." He said, "Looks easy enough to me." So I says, "Oh, right, okay." And he gets to the edge, the bloke says, "Jump in." He jumps in, swam across. Not a very elegant stroke, but he got across. And the guy said, "Have you swum before?" He said, "Nope." He said, "Well, let's just show you one or two of the techniques," he said, and away you go. Secondary school. It followed on from me failing the 11 plus. So Mum and Dad are distraught. They had great ideas, but I wasn't up to it. So the opportunity last two weeks of school, primary school, Mum pulls me out and off we go, working on the land, fruit picking or whatever. So I missed the entrance exam into my secondary school. So I might have done all right in that, but who knows? I was put in the middle stream. There were 5 streams and I was in the middle. First day, I'm looking around, and I've caught up with some of the old lads that I was at Stretton Suggers with. And I'm thinking, I can't possibly be in the same class as these guys, but I was. But they had a very good system. The first 3, because there were exams at the end of each term, first 3 went up, bottom 3 went down. So after 2 terms, I was up in the top stream, 1A1, and I'd found my own level, and that was fine. It was a secondary modern school, but it was only 8 years old. The facilities were unbelievable. The playing fields were like forever. We had rugby fields, a cricket pitch, football pitches, long jump pit, pole vault pit. It was amazing. We had our own swimming pool, our own brass band, we had our own coach. it was absolutely marvellous. I think it was a better school than the grammar schools. There were 2 grammar schools in Hereford, Hereford High School, Hereford Cathedral School for boys, and they were so old-fashioned and stuck in their ways. It is unbelievable. I had a great time. And at the end of my time at White Cross, as the school was called, I had enjoyed my sport all the way through and had got a fairly respectable list of qualifications. I went on to do ordinary national diploma in civil engineering at the local tech, and then went on to do higher national diploma in civil engineering at the Welsh School of Mines at Pontypridd. Went on to be called Polytechnic Morgwanog. What a mouthful. Only Englishmen on the course, with some Welshmen who had particularly strong ideas about being run by the English. They still have, but hey-ho, there you go. I learnt to play rugby the hard way. They could play rugby there, by goodness. I discovered beer and the odd ladies at the college. I was on a motorbike here, there and everywhere. And I had my first curry. Curries weren't big in Hereford, but in South Wales they certainly were. And I had a lifelong friend, he turned out to be, but kind of an enemy as well, because he was a curry expert. And he said, "You want one of these, boyo? Vindaloo. Lovely." Yeah, right. One thing and another, I sailed through the first year. Second year, things got a little bit confused, shall we say, and I failed the second year. So I was faced with the opportunity of repeating it there or repeating it somewhere else. I decided I'd go to Birmingham Polytechnic and repeat the second year there and live with Grandad. Granny by now has passed away, so it suited him to have me there and it suited me to have free accommodation. And it worked pretty well. No rugby, behaved myself, new bunch of mates, and I passed the exam. Into the world of employment, and I worked all over the place, just like my dad, journeyman, wherever the money was, that's where I was. Worked there till another job cropped up, paying more money, over there. You could do that in the 70s. There was plenty of work. The money was good. And not to bore you, some of the people I worked for on contracts such as sewers in Birmingham, Milford Haven on the oil refineries, a factory and office block on top of the old Velocette motorcycle factory in Hall Green in Birmingham, Biggs Wall, sewers, one of them at a place called Shrivenham, and there was a little bit of animosity with the locals, so I wrote a poem to go into the local village magazine, and it went something like this. In Shrivenham, Biggs Wall are building a sewer, and the footpaths are becoming much fewer. At night, when out for a stroll, you may fall down a hole, but put all the blame on the brewer. So, yeah, and then I kind of had a bit of a problem, the drink and driving and that sort of thing, and I put the company van through the hedge and knocked about a bit, a few stitches, and I could get radio 1, 2 and 3 where the windscreen wiper went under my scalp. But yeah, survived, young, stupid, and came to Lamberhurst. Went to the local doctor to have these stitches removed, and I think he was renowned for liking a drink himself. And I noticed as he was pulling the stitches out, he seemed to be pulling the end he'd cut and trying to pull the knot through the skin. And I thought, no, whoa, okay, I'll do the rest myself, thank you. Worked on the pipeline, which went up to the reservoir, Gleason's were the main contractors. We were the pipeline contractors. And Lamberhurst in those days was like the Klondike. I'm sure one or two of you remember it. Journeymen like myself, Irishmen, money like you wouldn't believe. They used to take £1,000 at what was then the Rising Sun on a Sunday lunchtime. That's when like £1 would get you half a pint of beer, so that's a lot of beer. But everybody started at dawn. It's 7 days a week, finished at midday, round to the brown trout, to the Rising Sun, now the brown trout. Mrs. Gallop wasn't particularly bothered keeping time, so all went well. Our pipeline was built, no great problems there, except when we tested it, it leaked, much to everybody's consternation. The Southern Water, who were the main the supervising people, who the job was for, said that we had to repair it at our own costs. This involved emptying the pipeline again, going inside with a transmitter and locating where each joint on the huge concrete pipes were. They were a metre internal diameter. We had some guys come down to help us with this task. Most of them took one look at the pipe and decided they weren't going to go inside that pipe. So we had one chap that would. His nickname was Geronimo. He was supposed to be a hard nut. He got halfway down and got wedged because he tried to turn round in the pipe. He was 6'4", and you can't turn round in a 1 metre pipe. So I had to go down and one way and another dissuade him from trying to turn round, uncoil himself, and we dragged him out. So yours truly ended up doing a lot of the survey. One of the problems was that we are connected to the reservoir. The reservoir is full of water, and if some Burke undoes the big butterfly valve and lets the water down while I'm down there, big problem. So I decide for my own survival, we would lock up the big valve. And they said, we've removed the fuse, it can't be done. I said, never mind about all that. We'll have a chain round it, big padlock, one key, I've got the key. So they said, all right, if that's what you want to do, fair enough. That all went very well till I went under the A21. Unbeknown to me, the GPO were up on the road above with jackhammers digging a big hole in the road. When you're inside a 1 metre pipe, 3 metres below them, and they're jackhammering above you, it's loud. And I thought that the reservoir was coming down to meet me, so that wasn't great. Anyway, we survived, and Maureen and I became an item. Having met her at lunchtime, she used to cook my lunch, and I wasn't the most exciting prospect, usually in a vest and shorts and hobnail boots covered in mud and dust. Imagine. One evening I must have had my good dudes on and in the pub, and yeah, that was all good. A bit of a recession hit, unfortunately, and I decided that I'd go abroad. So I worked in Iran on grain silos, in Tehran, Arak, Isfahan, Tabriz, Qom. Things started to get a bit nasty. The Ayatollah Khomeini had been sent away, and he was living in Paris. The Shah was running the country, and he was trying to bring it into the 20th century. Made a few mistakes, there's no doubt about it. Anyway, a war ensued. The Ayatollah came back and the Shah scarpered, and so did I. Not a good place to be. Went to Pakistan, worked on Port Kazim, which was a huge international project. Russians built the steelworks, the French built the roads and rails and unloading facilities, and we built the quay wall and did all the dredging. Mr. Bhutto was running the country, but then it all went pear-shaped and General Zaire Haque took over, and Mr. Bhutto found himself on the wrong end of a piece of rope. I'm not quite sure what his crimes were, but it was very, very much more passive with the army in charge. Lots of stories I could tell you about Pakistan, but I think we'll move on from those. Came back to Britain and decided not to take on long contracts abroad. So joined a company called Allen Dick up in Cheltenham, and they were a steel erection company, and went all over the world with them. But they were nice short contracts, 6, 8 weeks, 10, 12 at the most. I got some T-shirts printed off, which were very popular in the company, Erection by A. Dick and Company. Not best pleased some of the clients when the lads were wearing them, but hey-ho. Did a contract for an American company called TCI. And they had their own telecommunications and shortwave communications company. So they poached me, offered me better money and all the rest of it, so I went and joined them. First contract was on Cape Cod, just close to San Francisco. Boston. And our head office was in San Francisco, where the factory was. I got on pretty well, and had a bit of a run-in with the CIA, who thought that we were trying to interfere with the Kennedys, whose holiday home was only a few miles from where we were building this ruddy great antenna. So we explained to them that that wasn't the case, and they were satisfied and went away. Next big contract was in Australia, in Darwin, following Hurricane Tracy, who had gone through there, and she'd whipped up a lot of damage and destruction, and their antenna system needed rebuilding. Quite an interesting time. There's a few photographs dotted about there. One of me with a brown snake, which, is some of you may know, is one of the most dangerous snakes in the world. It had got up the antenna, but luckily one of the Aborigine lads climbed up and pulled it down and flung it, and it fell a few hundred feet, hit the deck, and I left it there for about 6 or 7 hours to make sure it was dead. Then I had my photograph taken with it. Came back home, worked for McAlpines on Chatham Hospital, for the Forestry Commission, and then the local firm Arnold and Nathans at East Peckham. Good time, nice jobs. And then I had a rush of blood and decided I'd try teaching. Don't ask me why, but I'm just bad as my granddad. Went to Brighton University for a couple of years. Breezed it really. It wasn't onerous at all, and it was in my trade. Teaching technology, metalwork, woodwork, technical drawing, that sort of thing. So all I needed to do was learn how to keep the records and how to teach, really, which, as you can see, I'm not very good at. I still managed to do 2 days a week on the tools, and luckily enough, I was at Brighton University. I got a job to convert the ground floor of a house into offices. And went along there one day and put my key in the door. The door opened so far, an inch or so, and then there was a door wedged behind it. Maybe Godfrey knows this is a standard strategy of a burglar. So he knows you can get in, you can unlock the door. How does he stop you? He puts a chair wedged under the handle. So I knew straight away what was going on. I ran round the back to the back door just as the burglar's coming out. I threw a punch at him, missed completely. He's turned round and gone back in the house. I thought, right, got you now, pal. He runs upstairs. I'm chasing after him. He goes into the front bedroom, which is over the street. And to my amazement, he jumped straight through the window down into the street. So I thought, oh, we got a piece of work here. So I shout through the hole in the window to the people in the street to stop this geezer. He's a burglar, but he's running off. Not very well. I run back down, back round the house, out to the street, chase after this geezer. I'm catching him up, but a policeman appears and arrests him. He's got 2 broken legs. But it turns out he was a drug addict, and he was just doing burglary to try and get some money for drugs, and he was as high as a kite, and he didn't even realise he got broken legs. Maureen, we must mention Maureen. I'm sorry, they're going to have to put up with it. One of 5, Theo, her dad, there's a display there of his time in the Royal Navy. He was an absolute hero. Russian convoys, backwards and forwards across the Atlantic. Have a look at the photographs. A lot of you here may have known Theo. 5 children, Helen, Maureen, Sheena, Bernie and Alistair. Florence, Maureen's dear mother, was a Glasgow girl. The Atlantic convoys would call into Glasgow, and that's where Theo and Florrie met, got married and came down to this part of the world. Florence's mother and her 2 brothers, some of you may have known Ernie and Bobby, both worked in the slaughterhouse, both very, very keen footballers. And Maureen married Colin, who was one of the sons of Jim and Monica. Some of you know Monica, Granny E. Jim was the local gamekeeper. You could write a book on their life. It was absolutely amazing. Jim was a Shropshire gamekeeper. Again, that part of the world cropping up. And he came here and worked at Penshurst Place for Lord Delisle, and then for McAlpine here in Lamberhurst. He was a sergeant in the artillery, badly wounded, came out at Dunkirk, but was back in again, D-Day +2. Hell of a guy. They had a big family, and Colin, unfortunately, passed away a few years ago. The big C got him, as it gets many people. Monica, Granny E, I bet a lot of you don't realise she was the Plumstead beauty queen. Yeah, quite a lady. Quite a lady. Still, I wouldn't say she's going strong, but she's still holding her own and looking forward to Christmas. At Robertsbridge, there's a couple of things there from the college, and that's where I worked for 10 years as a teacher. Right in the middle of my time there, in 2000, I don't know, here we go again. I decided to have a bit of a change, so I do a 1-year teacher exchange to Australia, 2 hours east of Melbourne, a place called Traralgon. What an eye-opener that was, the Australian education system. Don't take it badly, but ours isn't too bad in comparison with some. I inherit Dean and Lisa, and we had a great time growing up. Dean might have a few things to say about that, but anyway, it was great. Then Oliver comes along, and our kids go to the local primary school, and Dean and Lisa go to mass schools. Ollie goes to Judd. Dean joins the army as a junior soldier, and then 22 years in the Royal Engineers. Lisa trained as a nanny and brought up a lad called Felix in Tunbridge. No, not a cat. And Crowborough. She's had 3 children. Megan is at university, and the other 2, Cosmo and Yomi, Lisa and Sam, have just moved down to Torquay. Ollie lives in Hastings, married to Joe. He works from home on websites and things like that I don't really understand. And Joe works for Cripps in Tunbridge Wells. Maureen and I, we're still travelling constantly, wherever the whim takes us. We're off to Cuba at Easter, and then Mozambique, and after Mozambique on to New Zealand and Australia to visit my sister, who now lives in the Blue Mountains. Sorry it went on a bit, guys, but I hope you found it interesting. Please have a look at all the photographs we've laid out, give you some idea of some of the escapades we've got up to over the years. Thank you for listening.